This is Larry Jordan, the host of the Digital Production Buzz. The following interview is an excerpt from a recent program. To hear the entire program, visit digitalproductionbuzz.com. As Executive Director for Technology Strategy at Dolby Laboratories, Patrick Griffis helps define strategy for the company. He also serves on the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, called SMPTE, their executive committee, as the Vice President of Education, where he helps design SMPTE's conference technical programs and overall educational strategy. Hello, Pat. Welcome.
Hello. Great to be here.
We are actually looking forward to this conversation because Mike loves things like SMPTE and engineering and codecs and stuff. So we're looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, we're only kidding.
No, I hope you're not kidding. I hope you love it like I do.
Well, we're going to try. Actually, your job is to make me love it. So go ahead.
Okay, I hope to do that.
All right, thanks, Patrick.
Education shall set you free, as they say.
Patrick, how would you define SMPTE? What is it?
Well, SMPTE, as you mentioned, Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, has a rich history. Actually, the genesis goes back to 1916, and at the time, you might remember there was a world war. And believe it or not, there was a time when film standards weren't interoperable. And the U.S. government, as we're going to World War I, were getting film clips that wouldn't work together. And they said, this is crazy. We need a standard. And they set about forming a group, which became the Society of Motion Picture Engineers, to create a very simple standard to make sure all the sprockets were lined up so all the film would work interoperably. And from that humble beginning, SMPTE grew over the decades, began to take on some of the challenges of television in the 50s, and then became the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, where we are today.
If I remember right, back in the 1900s, in the early teens, film cameras didn't even have motors. The cameraman was turning the camera by hand, which meant frame rates were everything from 8 frames a second to 20 frames a second. Is that one of the reasons why they needed to put this standard together?
Oh, that was certainly one of the problems, and it depends whether if you had coffee in the morning or not, how fast the film would go. So certainly interoperability it was clearly a place where standards were very, very helpful, and certainly for the war effort.
Was this a bunch of Americans getting together and coming up with these standards, or was this a bunch of people from all over the world coming up with this standard?
Originally in the U.S. it was, you have Kodak and a bunch of companies here, and again, it was to support the war effort. But, there were different film approaches from around the world. So having a set of standards, something as simple as all the sprockets and the films being standard width was really, really important.
Well,
so here we are close to, I mentioned 1916. Next year is our 100th anniversary. So we're kind of now looking at the next generation of imaging as we head into our centennial.
Which is exactly what I want to talk about now, because we've moved from an analog film basis to a pixel basis. And before we start talking about this new technology, I was doing some research on you and kept stumbling over the phrase, I'm looking at my notes, the father of pixels. Where did that come from?
Huh?
But actually better pixels, not pixels itself. But I got pixel stands for picture element. I think most people are familiar, the smallest element that makes up a picture. But better pixels comes from the notion as we look at next generation of imaging, there's really only 3 ways to make a better picture. The first, of course, is more of those pixels. Technically speaking, higher spatial resolution. You certainly heard a lot about the buzz on that recently. If HD, which is 2 megapixels, is not enough, now there's interest in going to what people euphemistically call 4K, which is actually 8 megapixels because it's twice the number of horizontal pixels from 2K to 4K, and then twice the number of lines. So more pixels is one of the ways. Of course, if you have motion, as we were talking about, when you have motion and you start to pan a camera, the picture gets blurry because of motion blur, and you're losing temporal resolution. The way you fix that is to have more frames per unit time. More frames per unit time means more pixels per unit time, and we think of that as faster pixels. So this last one, the notion of better pixels, actually says, how do I make each one of those pixels better? no matter how many or how fast I'm sending them. And by better, we're talking about things closer to what we see every time we open our eyes, like brighter whites, blacker blacks, richer colors within the palette that we have available to us, and then the holy grail ultimately of getting closer to represent all the colors that we as human beings can see. So that was that notion. I coined the term better pixels, and it's become popular among some folks.
I'm going to talk about the better pixels in just a minute, but I want to go back a couple steps.
Sure.
We can have more pixels, which is higher resolution. We can have cleaner pixels, which is reducing motion blur. We can have better quality pictures, either with richer color saturation or greater grayscales. But really, are we changing the pixel? Because isn't it just a pixel's a pixel? It's the environment within which the pixel lives, or are we going to see a material difference in the pixel itself?
We're going to see a material difference in the pixel itself, because when you, whether you have more of them, they still are defined today by how many bits do you have per pixel. And typically pixels are represented as three colors, red, green, and blue. So a picture element actually has typically, three elements associated with it, red, green, and blue. And one of the things we do when we make them better is to have more bit depth, and also have them represent, a brighter transition from the maximum white to the blackest black, as well as more colors. So one of the notions, explaining a little bit more about that we get into is today in television, one of the notions we talk about is how bright something is, and the nomenclature we use for that when we measure how bright something is, luminance. The term is typically candelas per meter squared. It means if you shine a light meter at a light source, it tells you how bright it is in candelas per meter squared. And that's hard to say more than 3 times in a row, so we've come up with a euphemistic term of nits. And one of the other things people say about me is I'm nuts for nits, because I like to see more of them. So in making a better picture, the ability to represent those whiter whites or higher nits, and as well as the blacker nits, takes more bits. And that's one of the things that changes the pixel as we move to this exciting new world of better pixels.
Now, Patrick, back when those of us were playing with Photoshop, we could define the grayscale value of a pixel in 256 steps, where black is 0 and white is 256. As you move into this new high dynamic range space where we have more grayscale values, are we doubling that or tripling it, or just how bright is bright and how dark is dark if we're looking at it in the 255 step range?
Oh, 255 steps is not enough to represent the real world. As I like to say, every time you open your eyes, you see high dynamic range. And in fact, working with a lot of studios, this is some of the standards work that SMPTE does, we agreed to try to represent as much as we could for entertainment purposes with about 12 bits. And by the way, in the real world, we as human beings deal with tremendous dynamic range, from the brightness of the sun, which is about 1.6 billion nits, to a dark, moonless night, and of course, maybe even in caves, or if you didn't see the saber-toothed tiger coming, you weren't around for the next generation. That's 10 to the minus 6. So 15 orders of dynamic range as human beings we have to deal with. But of course, we can't see sunlight and starlight at the same time because our iris adjusts up and down, and we adapt to a lighting environment. So the question we asked ourselves is, for entertainment, we don't need 1.6 billion nits, apart from needing a small nuclear power plant to power the television. Blinding the eyes of our consumers is probably not a good entertainment proposition. And on the dark side, while we can see very dark environments, it takes a long time for our eyes to adjust, often several hours. So 30-minute scene changes aren't practical. So what we were interested in is what's a useful range for entertainment purposes. And to that point, what we concluded is that for CGI content, to guarantee that there's no artifacts in any case, you actually needed 12 bits or 4096 to use your example. So from 8 bits, 0 to 255, to 12 bits, 0 to 4095, I guess you could say.
Now, there's been a lot of debate as we look at these new frame rates, which give us cleaner pixels, and as we look at increasing the dynamic range, that we're losing the traditional entertainment value that we grew up with film, that motion blur actually makes the scene more believable as opposed to the stark reality of very, very clean, sharp edges. How much do we need to worry about the past cinema viewing experience with motion blur, with low illumination, and how much does that change and perhaps degrade the viewing experience when images are brighter, pixels are crisper, and we can see edges more clearly?
That's a great question. And in fact, motion blur in the real world gives us the sense of really, really high speed. It's so fast that even our eyes can't detect it. So you're right, and there's been a lot of work to show that higher frame rate, imagine a boxer who's punching and you now suddenly capture it at a very, very high frame rate and you can see the hands move. It doesn't appear to be as fast as when you have motion blur. So the creatives understand that, and a lot of the work we're doing now is actually to give them the ability to dial in blur when it adds to the story, when it is part of the artistic intent. And there are other cases where you actually want to see that motion, particularly in some 3D scenes, when there's too much motion that's too blurry, you can't see the details. So that becomes, we think, a knob you can dial in going forward. So having higher frame rate has a role, having motion blur has a role, and we're now trying to come up with ways where it actually is something a creative can dial in as needed.
Well, there's a downside to this, and that is if we have higher resolution, 4K, 6K, 8K, if we have higher frame rates, if we have greater bit depth, our file sizes, which are already large, are going to become unbelievably huge. How are we going to store all this stuff?
It's going to be great for cloud services, I guess. More memory, yes. And of course, that becomes the storage. Of course, is always an issue, and one of the other lines I'm famous for is bits or bucks. Whether you're capturing them, delivering them, or storing them, or rendering them, they come with a price tag, or you earn money from them. So, indeed, compression has never been shown to improve picture quality. It's all about bit rate efficiency while preserving the quality of the image. And indeed, you're right. These file sizes are getting bigger. And as we talk about delivery over pipes like the internet or broadcast pipes, that becomes a case where we need better compression technologies to try to preserve the quality without, and reducing the bit rate at the same time.
That was an excellent line about preserving the quality. And we were just talking about a couple days ago that it's all over the news. VP10, which is Google's compression codec, which will apparently take half the bandwidth of 4K out of the equation, so we can have half the bandwidth. And so we're doing this almost every year. And so it'll be interesting to, well, I'm talking about codecs again, Larry. So I'm getting tongue-tied here. So excuse me, but the VP10, which is what they're, VP9, I guess, is what's.
But Patrick, I want to pick up on Michael's point. At what point do we do compression? Because as soon as you do compression, you're taking away bit depth, you're taking away data from the file that we need for editing. For people that are doing production and post, we can't go to compression until we're ready to do distribution, correct? So our file sizes remain huge.
Yes, they already are huge. For movie, you're looking at terabytes of data. And on the local storage side, local storage continues to increase and improve. So the bigger file sizes, already today, if you're doing animation, typically they work in 16-bit floating points. So the notion of going to greater bit depth actually for them is a blessing, because often you take these really wonderful pieces of content and you squeeze them down to 8 bits and throw away color samples. So they're pleased in many ways, because for the first time they'll be able to get closer to rendering something that was actually sitting in their computers. So for animation, it's actually not such a big deal. But for live and these other things, we have the issue of pipe sizes are always the problem.
Before we run out of time, I want to talk with you quickly about Dolby Vision. So take your SMPTE hat off, put your Dolby hat on. What is Dolby doing in this regard?
Well, in this regard, Dolby Vision is really our implementation of these next generation standards. One of the things I didn't talk about yet is when we sat down and said, what would the next generation entertainment experience be? What's a useful range for dynamic range for entertainment purposes? And I mentioned some work that led to a conclusion that 0 to 10,000 nits would be a useful range. 10,000 nits, by the way, is 100 times brighter than what we typically deliver in television today. And so Dolby Vision, we also realized that if we're designing for the next generation with a clean sheet of paper, why would we use a system based on the legacy of cathode ray tubes that go back to the 50s and a convenient artifact of physics called gamma, which defines the way they make light? Gamma is a great, it was a convenient artifact of physics, but it doesn't represent the way the human eye sees. So some of the work we did was to say, what would an ideal system be that models the human eye? And that led to work that actually brings me back to SMPTE. We created a new standard for the future called SMPTE ST2084.
Okay, but wait. This is going to take us the next week and a half to describe, so I want to sort of cut it short. SMPTE already has a spec for HDR, and it also has a spec for wide color gamut. Why is Dolby creating its own spec in competition with SMPTE?
Oh, the spec that SMPTE has was based on Dolby's contribution. So we standardized the technology, and now we're implementing it. So what Dolby Vision does is we implement those standards. We have a variety of ways of delivering that quality in either a backwards compatible fashion, because many in the OTT world have legacy content, standard dynamic range, and you can add the high dynamic range on top of existing files. It is an option within the Blu-ray standard. And indeed, we also are implementing Dolby Vision in cinema, and we call it Dolby Cinema. There are already theaters like AMC, and then been some movies from Disney that have been delivered with Dolby Vision. So high dynamic range, wide, brighter colors, better contrast than you've ever seen before. That's really what, and an end-to-end ecosystem. We have the tools, the delivery mechanisms. So it's actually a full ecosystem with products and services.
Patrick, we're going to have to talk with you again because this is really cool stuff. For people that want to learn more, where can they go on the web?
Well, in terms of SMPTE, I guess www.SMPTE.org, and then, of course, you can go to the Dolby website to learn more about Dolby Vision.
And Patrick Griffis is the VP of Education for SMPTE and the Executive Director of Tech Strategy for Dolby. Patrick, thanks for joining us today.
It's been fun, and definitely more to say.
Take care. Look forward to it. Bye-bye.